Michelle. All right, so first off, I usually give this presentation to people and not to just the unknown masses across the WebEx. So this is a little bit different for me because I can't get the actual feedback if you folks are following along or have any questions. So I'll be relying on Michelle to flag down if there are some questions I need to pay attention to. So here's the agenda that I'm going to cover. First thing to note is that this presentation is slightly different than the one that's posted on the portal. I've customized it for how I use it when I'm in the field, and I would suggest you do the same. But what we're going to cover first is what is Google Enterprise, and then setting the stage a little bit in terms of how things are going today for most companies. What are the messaging and collaboration challenges? Then talking about how we approach the cloud and the product itself. A couple other notes about this presentation. One is it's focused primarily on people that already have an on-premise solution or are considering an on-premise solution. As you're probably aware, there's also going to be companies that are using webmail or maybe an ISP hosted offering or something along those lines. And so some of the value prop scenarios might be a little bit different, but hopefully this will still be useful for those scenarios. Another thing I believe is that it's important to set the stage as to how we're different in a good way and not just a feature functionality discussion. I think there's a relatively decent and growing awareness of Google Apps amongst the marketplace, but there's still a perception in a lot of people's minds that we're a cheap web version of what they're already using today. And we think that we're doing things in a more cost-effective manner, but also in a better way. So starting off, what is Google Enterprise? Some of you may know this, but a lot of people don't, and definitely a lot of our customers and prospects don't. But Google Enterprise is a real breathing entity within Google that has nearly 1,000 people. We've been around for about 6 or 7 years now, and we literally have tens of thousands of customers before you talk Google Apps. So the Search Appliance was the first product we released back, I think it was about 7 years back. Moved into Google Maps and Google Earth so people could take the maps and bring it into their sites or use it internally. We acquired Postini a few years ago, and that's part of the Google Apps family, and then obviously Google Apps. When I'm giving this part of the presentation, I'm going to give it to you folks with some commentary along the way, so it's not exactly the same way that I do it with a customer, but I do usually own up to the fact that, yes, we say there's 3,000 businesses that sign up every day for Google Apps, and that probably equates to about 4,000 users. So every couple of weeks we'll get a really big company, Motorola, Genentech, Avago, City of Washington, D.C. We're definitely getting a lot more large companies, but I do front up the fact that, yeah, we do have a lot of very small companies too. And actually, one last point on that previous slide. I also think it's important to recognize that what Google Enterprise is doing is an extension of what Google does. So where a lot of companies have started in the enterprise and they offered consumer versions of their product, Google started by having consumer versions of the product, finding out what people liked and didn't like, and then we in the enterprise group were able to leverage that. So it actually really helps us bring an effective product to market. So setting the stage in terms of the challenges that exist today for companies. First and foremost, it's just expensive. And we're going to dig into each of these points a little bit more, but A, it's expensive from a licensing and hardware and maintenance cost. B is the labor requirements, and that's probably one of the more important points, is that not only is the cost in terms of hard dollars important, but it takes a lot of effort to maintain those systems. And no company is going to be able to beat their competitors because they have a better email system. They should be able to redevote those resources towards other activities that are more core to the functionality of the business. One of the things I actually reference here quite a bit is there's an author, Geoffrey Moore, who wrote things like Crossing the Chasm and Into the Tornado, and one of his more recent books is Dealing with Darwin. Within the Dealing with Darwin, I actually saw him speak at a Gartner event, and he had mentioned that there's a big difference between core activities and context activities. Core activities are the things that companies do to make them better than their competitors. Context is everything else. And he actually said, what is more context than email? And that made the rest of my event very easy because he kind of led off the keynote address with my pitch. But that's the whole point, is that companies can make really reliable and functional email systems for themselves, but it takes a lot of work, and why should they? And then lastly, there's user limitations. The amount of storage you have, how can you find the information, where can you get the information from? And so the question sits in most of these people's heads of, how can they do these things at a lower cost with better performance? So here's a breakdown of how Forrester looks at the overall cost of a messaging infrastructure. The first thing you're going to notice is there's a lot of different components to that $300. There's the hardware and OS, the software for the server, the software for the client, storage, staffing, And then message archiving is an additional option. We offer it here within Google Apps, our GMD product, Google Message Discovery. So that may or may not come into play for a lot of companies, but it really should. More and more companies need to have an answer of how do I store my email for archiving and retention and legal recovery purposes. And the reality is a lot of people are just doing tape backups. And that's fine to some degree when you actually just do your weekly backups. It's not perfect because you can just delete your email the day before the backups are taken and it might not be stored. And the second thing is actually finding that email after the fact is going to be a heck of a lot harder. But so that's where some of the costs come up, and that's how we came up with that $300 price point. Another major consideration is the fact that the upgrades are A, slow and painful. It takes a long time to consider all those different pieces between the hardware and the software and so on. And then the second thing is that it never ends. I frequently talk to companies right now that are considering moving to Microsoft Exchange 2007. It is middle of August in 2009. Now, Exchange 2007 was probably in development from 2003, 2004 kind of time frame, and if they started it today, they might be able to get it up and running by the end of the year, but most likely not until 2010. So they're already 3 years behind the release date, and then the next version of the Exchange is going to be out, and it's a never-ending cycle that they're on. And a lot of times, I've asked people why did they want to go to Exchange 07, and one of the more common ones I hear is unified communications. There's some more functionality in Exchange 07 to help out with unified communications. Unfortunately, if you wanted to get that functionality, you have to go through a really large upgrade process in terms of moving your servers from 32-bit to 64-bit and getting your entire infrastructure ready and then moving on to Exchange 07 just to get that one additional piece of functionality. With a hosted offering, that's all much easier. And then there's limitations. From the administration side, it just takes time to manage these pieces of your infrastructure. Now here at Google, this is what we do. We have huge data centers. Google's been around for 10 years building out data centers for Google Search and all the other products that we have, Google Maps and Google Earth and so on from the consumer side. So the infrastructure already exists for us, and building that infrastructure is a core competency of Google. Second is that you're going to always have some planned downtime with an on-premise implementation. You're going to need to do server upgrades and so forth. There's zero planned downtime with Google Apps. And then as I mentioned earlier is the opportunity cost. Yes, you can put together a very effective email system with your own resources, but don't you have better things to do? I've never met a CIO or an IT department that said that they're done with their projects and they have nothing better to do with their time. Unfortunately, there's always projects they can't get to that would truly help the business, but they have to be put on the back burner because the more mission critical or keeping the lights on types of projects take precedence. And then from the user limitation side, I'm sure we all recognize these, but the fact that you get the message saying you can't send or receive email unless you delete some of your email. And as you know, Google gives 25 gigabytes of storage within Google Apps Premier. Now, I've had some companies ask me, Tom, you can't tell me honestly that you need every single email that you've ever received. And that's absolutely true. However, I don't know which ones I do and don't need until the time comes that I need them. So in the old-fashioned days of having to delete email from time to time to stay underneath a threshold, I would arbitrarily decide which emails not to keep. And usually I'd be right, but every now and again I might delete an email that maybe 6 months or 8 months down the road I'd need. I'm never forced to that decision since I've been on Google Apps. Slow search. So a lot of people would say, yeah, but I don't really need the search as much because I can navigate through my folders, I can sort and everything. And yes, that stuff does work, but it's just not nearly as effective as search. A good way to think about this is to see how the evolution of the web went, where 10 years ago there were a lot of directory search sites. So if you wanted to find something, you might first go into the first topic of, let's say I want to find the score of the Giants game. I'd go into sports and entertainment, then I'd drill into Major League Baseball, then I'd drill into scores, and then I'd be able to find the score of the game. These days you just do a search for score San Francisco Giants, and you find what you're looking for right away. So while it is a little bit different, and people are very accustomed to working within their navigation and hierarchies and so forth, once you move over to Gmail and you start using the search, there's no question that's a more effective way to find what you're looking for. And then the poor collaboration experience. The products that came out for the client server, 15 years ago or so, they were basically analogs to what people were using in paper processes. So the inbox and the outbox. Back in the day, I actually had on my desk an inbox and an outbox where I'd put faxes that need to be sent out and things like that. And we would work in a very linear process where a piece of paper would go from person A to person B to person C. The world just isn't like that anymore. People are working together on documents at the same time, but with a lot of the older technologies, you can't do that. So that's a bit of a background on where people are at today. And because we're doing it so differently, they may or may not think that that's a huge problem. But I kind of equate it to the first time I got a remote control. Before I had a remote control, I didn't think it was that big of a deal to get up and walk across the room and change a channel. But now I find myself watching horrible TV shows because the remote's out of reach. And you just become accustomed to these things. So once you have the better technology, it just becomes ingrained in the way that you work and live, and it makes your life much more productive, outside of when I'm sitting and watching crap TV. So now how Google approaches all this. First off, we believe that messaging and collaboration are better in the cloud. These are pretty much standard types of applications that we're talking about. This isn't necessarily, your ERP system or something that's very customized for your business. This is email. So we can do it much cheaper at about less than a third of the cost. No hardware or software to maintain. And we'll go through all these points in more detail, but we are actually more reliable and more secure than what people can do themselves, and it's a better user experience. Now here's a quote at the bottom from Gartner. Gartner's obviously very well respected within the industry, and they said that Matt Kane, who's the main messaging analyst for Gartner, said that 20% of enterprise email seats will be switching over to a SaaS model. I personally don't put this on my slides when I'm giving a presentation, primarily based upon the fact that 20% doesn't sound like a huge number, and the rest of that quote is that that's by 2012. And so I think it's very easy for people to say, well, I can just kind of wait. But a lot of smaller companies, they can get there much more quickly. This is enterprises, maybe 10, 15, 30,000 people. And so it's going to take them a little bit longer time to get there. But it is nice validation to get from Gartner that the cloud is coming. So here, going back again to the Forrester component, as I showed earlier, all the different pieces add up to over $300. With Google Apps, it's less than $90, and that's including the archiving. So a couple points to notice here. First is, we have a subscription fee and they don't. But look at the amount of staffing. The big blue on the bottom of the on-premise is all staffing, and then we just have a thin slice. And that's, again, because you don't have to keep the infrastructure up and running. And then there's all those other components, so you can see how it works out. But that's all included within Google Apps. One of the more common places that people tend to upgrade or use as the cost justification for upgrading to Google Apps is ask them what they're paying for anti-spam and antivirus today. From my experiences, people are paying anywhere from $10 to $20 a user a year for that functionality, and we include that at no additional cost for Google Apps. So now you're talking about $30 or $40 that you have to justify to bring in apps. Superior reliability and less administration. So first off, statistically, we have better uptime than on-premise solutions. And now on the left chart there, you'll see the planned downtime. With Gmail, there's no planned downtime. With every other on-premise solution, you're going to have, on average, some level of planned downtime. And then this is coming from the Radicati group, so it's always nice to reference third-party sources who can validate this information for you. And then our unplanned downtime is much less, too. And then the amount of administrative time, same thing. So, and it is a bit of an interesting conversation you can get into sometimes. I've had conversations with IT departments where they'll tell me, oh, we haven't had an outage in 2 years. Excellent. How much effort did it take to get there? And if we had, say, 7 hours of downtime last year, was it worth that amount of effort to get that extra 7 hours of uptime across the year? So we got the uptime, and the next component is the security. And security actually falls into two different buckets. There's security, and then there's data privacy. So this slide is speaking specifically of security, but Google's data centers are more secure than any other company's data centers. First off, we are the second most targeted property for hackers on the web after the DoD. Everybody would love to attack Google, and so it's always been in our best interest, well before we even conceived of Google Apps, to make sure that our sites are secure. But just some more data behind all this. Google's actually the fourth largest manufacturer of servers in the world. We're building this huge infrastructure, and we've been doing it for going on 10 years plus now. And again, even without Google Apps, we have billions of dollars flowing through our systems all the time. AdWords is primarily an e-commerce driven business, and it's a $20 billion a year business. So again, without even considering the email component of it, obviously we're going to have all the right security components in place if we're going to be able to run that kind of a business. And we have millions of AdWords customers that are putting their credit card numbers into the system. So again, security has always been about most important to us. Now, this next point I didn't really understand for quite some time, and I just kind of said it and I didn't dwell on it, but then I've had some further conversations, and this one's actually pretty important too. So we have hundreds of thousands of identical servers, and it's on our own custom Linux stack. So what that means is a couple things. One is it's a lot harder to find a vulnerability in an operating system if it's not an operating system you can easily get access to. So I've never been to a Google data center. Michelle's never been to a Google data center. Most Googlers can never get to it, and nobody from outside of Google can get into those. I just got a note from somebody in the room. Jeff, he has been into a Google data center, so you guys can ask him what it's all about. But that's what he gets for being on the engineering side of things. But at any rate, by having the custom Linux stack, it's our own operating system. People can't find the vulnerabilities by buying a copy down at Best Buy or Fry's or what have you, like you can with a Windows OS or something along those lines. Secondly, is because every single server is the same, if we ever do need to make changes, we can make those changes at scale very, very easily. It's the exact same thing across all the different data centers, and we know how to make those switches in and out. And again, our scalability is not important just for Google Apps, but for Google as a whole. Google.com, Google Maps, Google Earth, Checkout, so on and so forth. And so this is the core competency. This is probably what sets Google apart from all of our competitors in the cloud offering, is that we've been really focusing on these data centers. You know, and we've seen a lot of other companies starting to move into the cloud, but we're years ahead of them in terms of making sure that these data centers are as efficient as possible. There's actually a YouTube video where we showed, I think it was circa 2005, some of the technology that we use in our data centers. But it's a pretty interesting watch, and it shows how advanced we are in some of the things that we're doing, and we keep pushing that forward further and further. In terms of the data distribution and multi-tenant model, my email is spread across multiple data centers at any given time. Theory being that if a meteor hits one data center, I'm not going to notice it, unless, of course, that data center is near me, in which case I probably won't notice anything because there will be a meteor that just hit. But we have the data obfuscation on the disk, so it's secure. People can't find it. Even if I was to find the hard drive, I couldn't get in there. And here's another, good component about the data privacy piece that I was mentioning. At a lot of companies, you have an email administrator who might have access to everybody's individual emails. I personally would trust a company like Google, where our brand is on the line all the time, much more over somebody maybe that you have to hire a new administrator. You don't really know that person. I mean, the level of background checking you can do is always debatable. So I have actually myself worked at companies where I know for a fact the email administrator did read the emails of other people, where at Google, even if you found the server where some of the email was, it's obfuscated on disk, and so you couldn't just go read it. And then the last point here is SAS 70 Type 2 certification. This was effectively a seal from an auditor who came in and said, yep, you guys are doing what you're doing, and we agree that that's a good set of processes. Now, again, we've been working with the security and the infrastructure teams here at Google for years building out these data centers, and we're very confident that the security components are all in place, but SAS 70 Type 2 certification is important for the market, and that's something where a third party comes in and tells you, yes, we agree with it. And that was actually a nice addition that we got from our Postini folks when we acquired them. They'd already gone down these paths, so we're able to leverage that quite a bit. This slide shows a little bit of an idea of getting off of that upgrade treadmill that I was mentioning earlier. Since 2008, you can see nearly 120, I'm sure by now this slide's a little bit out of date, but 120 different releases added to the product. And some of them are really large ones, like Google Sites or Google Video for Business. Some of them are really functional ones, such as the ability to integrate with BlackBerry Enterprise Server or Microsoft Outlook Sync. There's a lot of really small ones in there too, but the point is our users got those for free, and they automatically just came into the product. You didn't have to worry about doing a full 6 or 12 or 18-month project to upgrade your infrastructure just to get that functionality. So that's kind of our take on what the cloud is and why it's a more scalable and more logical solution. Now let's dig into the product a little bit. First off, Gmail is a better email experience for every individual, and we believe it's the best email experience for businesses. Again, Outlook, Lotus Notes, and the different mail clients that exist today, people are very accustomed to them. Those were created 15 plus years ago when you might have gotten 5, 10 emails a day. Gmail was created 5 years ago when we recognized that people are going to be getting hundreds and thousands of emails every single day. So it was inherently built for people with the knowledge that there's going to be a huge volume of email going through there. And I just see a note coming here from Justin, integration of BlackBerry Enterprise Server. Yes, we announced that, and I believe the official release date is coming in the next week or so. We've been doing it in Trusted Tester for a while, but it should be available any day now. And just for your reference, that's going to be working with the Exchange flavor of the BlackBerry Enterprise Server. So you'd still need to have an Exchange flavor BES on site, and then we've written a connector to make it look like Google Apps is an Exchange server. So accessing content anytime, anywhere, on any device. This is huge. Early in my career, I was at a company that had Lotus Notes, and I had a desktop at work, and I wanted to be able to work from home. So after about 3 years, they finally let me hook up a VPN from my home computer into the Notes network. Now, it was a huge problem from a support standpoint because I'm a sales guy and I know just enough to be dangerous and press a bunch of buttons but then break things and then ask for help, and they always had to help me through the VPN issues. But they felt it was necessary to help me be productive. So then over time, I had a laptop. Well, what happens if you lose your laptop? And, there's all sorts of issues that come about there. Now, I never bring my computer home anymore. I have a computer at home. And as long as I have access to the web, I can get to all my email and all my content that's on Google Apps. I can also do it from my phone or what have you. And so it just makes people much more productive, For better or for worse, it's no longer a 9 to 5, come in, sit down at your desk, do your work, and go home and not work anymore. Everybody just kind of works wherever they're at. I mean, generally I'm giving this presentation on site at a customer, and I generally reference how I might have been in a cab right beforehand, and I was checking my email and responding to people and keeping up with things remotely without having to worry about any of the, do I have access to my machine? Touched on this earlier, but 25 gigs of storage, that's huge. I can just keep everything I need. Sub-second search results, anybody who's had a lot of email and Gmail and being able to search across it's fantastic. One of the best things is when you do a search, you get just one result back. It just feels really good when you do that and you realize, wow, this is just so functional. And another point that I'd probably mention right around here too is that I was a Gmail user from a consumer side well before I started using it for work. A lot of the benefits that I gain out of Gmail from work are much more obvious than when I use it personally. I mean, personally, I do only get maybe a dozen emails a day at most, as compared to hundreds of emails a day in my work environment. So a lot of these features and functionalities are really meant for a heavy email user. Conversation view or threaded conversations. This is something that once you learn to understand how it works, it's great. It's certainly, and this is more of a commentary, this isn't my pitch, but it's certainly one of the things that people have a real love-hate relationship with. It's important to ensure that you train your users on what it means. But an example of the value of this is I did a search for an email the other day, and there was a thread that's been going on and off for about 9 months. And all of that was together with emails kind of sporadically attached to this thread over the course of the past 9 months. And I was able to read it in order and understand exactly what was going on. So I had full context of the conversation, and when I looped in somebody else onto that thread, they had full context of the conversation too. So the benefits are there, but I will admit that that can be a bit of a challenge for people to get comfortable with. So certainly make sure that you don't gloss over that. And then some seemingly minor things, but the way that we integrate chat with both text, voice, and video. Text chat is fantastic in the sense that reply by chat. There's a lot of times where I might have an email thread going back and forth, and if I can reply by chat, I can get maybe a little question answered right on at that second, as opposed to sending another email that might get responded to in the next day or so and having that thread expand out over several days. I can get the question I'm looking for answered and move on about and be productive with the rest of my day. We're starting to use voice and video chat a heck of a lot more here internally at Google, where, as Michelle's mentioning, I've been on the road quite a bit, and I've been able to dial into meetings from my hotel room using the video chat, and I can just be part of that meeting as opposed to having to worry about finding an office and going in at some other time. So it really adds a lot of functionality, and it's all connected automatically within your network. So I know that I can just type M. Wazowski and get to Michelle and automatically be able to start chatting with her. I don't have to know what her AOL or Yahoo or any other IM name is, where we used to do that internally here before we had the Gmail chat embedded, was we used AOL quite a bit. But then you always had to know what their username was, and if you didn't know somebody's username was, you couldn't chat with them. So again, bringing it into the email just makes a ton of sense. And as I have down there at the bottom, the interoperability with Outlook and BlackBerry Enterprise servers is relatively new. I would caution people a little bit around the Outlook component. It's not going to be the exact same thing as working with Outlook with Exchange, but it's a great way to get people who are very hesitant to come over. One of the biggest things that we found is that once people come over to Gmail, they really start to like it. But there are going to be some people who are going to be very hesitant to make any changes. The best way to get them to make that change is have the people around them starting to use Gmail. And when you see your neighbors using it and they start talking about the benefits of it, then they'll be much more likely to come over too. But we have seen some challenges when companies want to say, hey, I'm going to let all my users completely use Outlook, not change their experience at all in any way whatsoever, and just have Gmail replace the Exchange servers. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that in many instances, although if they're using it in a very vanilla way, that might work, but again, just something to be cautious of. Let's see another note in here about Exchange folder views. Labels are better than folders, no two ways around it. Sometimes an email just belongs in two different places. And with labels, you can apply as many different labels as you want to, And you can add and take off labels really easily. So for instance, I used to have a folder of to-do, and then I'd have a folder of, let's say, marketing. And now I can actually put both labels on it, and when my to-do part of it is done, I can take that label off of it really quickly. But you know what? I don't even use them all that much anymore, because now I just search for it. So it's one of those things people think they need, but they don't really need it once they get adopted into the search paradigm. Another piece, actually, right along that line is offline. We thought offline was going to be a huge component for us and that everybody was going to use it when we released it. And we're actually really surprised to find out how few people use it. It's one of those things that everybody thinks they need, but generally speaking, if you're not connected to an internet, you don't need to be working. People do need some time off. Now, I'm flying back to the East Coast again today, and the last 4 flights I've been on, 4 different airlines, every single one of them had Wi-Fi on it. So if people are really complaining about the flight, they can get Wi-Fi on the plane a lot of times too. But we do have IMAP. You do have the Glo connector, the Outlook connector for Google Apps Sync or whatever long name we came up with on it. And then we do have offline for Gmail. So you can work offline if you need to, but what we found is more often than not, people really don't need it that badly.
Hey, Tom, can we go back to the Gmail slide really quick?
Yeah, of course.
We're getting a lot of questions regarding Gmail and privacy, people saying that Google reads emails within Gmail. Can you talk a little bit more about privacy?
Sure. I'm waiting for you to mute because I can kind of hear my echo. There, perfect. All right, so contractually, within our Premier Edition, we say we don't do any data mining, we don't read your email. Pragmatically, we just don't have the facilities to do it. It's just not very easy for us to do, and there's really no benefit for us to do it. That's one of the differences between the free and the Premier version. There is some scanning of the email in terms of making sure there's no viruses or spam and things like that in there, but there's absolutely, and it's contractually agreed to and obligated by Google, that we will not read any of the content. You own the data. We don't have access to it. One of the questions we hear a lot of times is, well, what if Google gets subpoena for my data? Our policy is to first notify you, the customer, that we're being served with a subpoena, and then allow you to choose how to go forward. We're not just going to give the data over to the party that's subpoenaing us, unless, of course, there are some rare instances that's never actually happened. But in theory, there could be an instance where they serve a blind subpoena where you're not allowed to know about it. But again, that's never happened in the past few years, and we don't even know the situation where it could come up. But I think I'm pretty much legally obligated to tell you that that would be the one instance where we would pass it off, is if there is a blind subpoena. Any other questions around Gmail at this point? We're going to keep moving.
No, let's move on for now.
Cool. Docs and sites. So the first thing you hear from anybody who has taken a little bit of a look at Docs and not really dove into it is, yeah, it's not Microsoft Office. And that's correct. And the first thing I say in response to that is, when's the last feature that went into Microsoft Office that the vast majority of your users really cared about? More and more Office is becoming a product that is specialized for people in finance or people in legal, and it's got a lot of features and functionalities that we don't have in Docs, no question about it. But they're features and functionalities that your users just don't need. And we have a lot of features that they don't have. So the ability to collaborate real-time on a document. With the new versions of Office coming up, there's more and more functionalities coming in along these lines. But from everything I've heard so far, you're going to need to have an instance of SharePoint running behind it to be able to make that functionality work. So again, the question is, how much effort is it going to take to get to that level of functionality? We just give it to you automatically. Having the revision history. So one of the things that I've heard previously is people sending emails with attachments around back and forth, and then accidentally starting to work off an old version as opposed to the new version, and you can have all sorts of confusion there. The paradigm of having one doc that you invite multiple people to just makes a ton of sense. Another real-life example for me was I used to have a spreadsheet that came from one of our distributors with a search appliance, and I would send it out to about a dozen reps on my team. They would all have to annotate the spreadsheet and send it back to me, and then I'd have 12 spreadsheets that I'd have to compile back into one. Now I have a Google spreadsheet. I share it out to all of them. They make their edits. I use the notifications functionality within Google Spreadsheets to email me as people make their edits, and I can easily understand what's going on. Justin's found the secret way to get his questions directly to me, so I'm just going to keep answering them. But what about sharing my public folders? All right, public folders. 9 times out of 10, what we found from talking to companies is that people use those because they didn't have anything else to use. And it's really not, email's not the best place to do that kind of work. So Google Sites is actually a really good way to get this solution going, where within Sites we have a page type called File Cabinet. So you can attach documents to it, and you can invite people to it. It's very easy to manage that way. Public folders are, again, it's an artifact of how people worked given the technology and the tools that they had in place. But there are many, many use cases for public folders, so it is important to understand how are you using it, and is there a better way to be doing this? And Sites tends to be one of the more common answers for that. Building sites is very easy. If you haven't, I definitely suggest you dig into it a little bit. I position it as maybe somewhere between a wiki and SharePoint, where there's a lot of features and functionality in SharePoint that we definitely don't do, but there's also a lot less work it takes to, again, make it run and have the infrastructure behind it. When I talk to a company who's using SharePoint and you talk to the users, they tend to like it if they're completely unfettered and they can just go build whatever they want to build. They don't like it as much if they have to follow a lot of process and procedure to do things. Now, you talk to the IT people, and it's actually the exact reverse of that. They want to make sure that there's well-architected and defined story as to how you're going to grow this infrastructure. Otherwise, it's going to get out of control on them really quickly. But those two pieces are just completely at odds with each other. With Google Sites, the workers can go off and build whatever they want to build without IT having to worry about the infrastructure components behind it. A good example of this is I have a third party that does some telemarketing for my team. And I wanted to build a site that had things like scripts and FAQs and various pieces of collateral and so forth. So I built a site, and I put all the content up there, and I shared it out to them, and they have access to it. So a couple things about the little implementation that I put together. First off, I put it together as a sales guy. I didn't have to get anybody from IT to help me out. Secondly, is as I made changes to the scripts, those changes took effect in real time. The old way of doing it would have been to send an email with a bunch of attachments to them, and if I did need to make changes to any of the content, I would have had to hope and pray that they actually used the new and updated version of the content without having a whole lot of understanding as to if that was the case. But by having it hosted, I was able to make those changes and know exactly what version they're working off of. Another one is the fact that as I found out that people were leaving or joining the team working on it, I could give them or take away their access. So again, it's not like I sent them an email and they have that information forever stuck in their email. They no longer have access to the site. They couldn't get to the content anymore. Now, without Google Sites, if I wanted to actually make an extranet type of portal like that, I would have had to go to IT. I would have had to explain to them what the ROI was. We'd have to talk about how long it's going to last, what's it going to scale to, and all these other questions that, quite frankly, I didn't have answers for, nor did I have any interest in determining the answers for, and so I would have just done emails and attachments. The other thing I see replacing internally here a lot is things that used to be done on the whiteboard or on flip charts are now done within Google Docs and Sites. There's a lot of times when you might be working on a project and it's the most important thing for about a week and a half until the next most important thing comes up, and the first project goes by the wayside. But then 6 months down the road, you say, you know what, I need to get back to that, but we erased the whiteboard and we threw away the flip charts, so we're starting over again. And by keeping it all in Docs and Sites, A, you have it forever, and B, it's searchable, and so you can really leverage that information that you've been building over time.
Tom, we have a couple specific questions on Docs that we can go over right now.
Okay.
First, there's a question on where we are in the maturity of Docs, i.e. if we should expect to continue to see new features integrated in the future.
Absolutely. We continue to add more and more features to Docs in terms of just basic formulas and so forth. Almost every formula that you can imagine from Microsoft Excel you're going to find in spreadsheets. And I talk about Docs across all of them with presentations, spreadsheets, and documents. We keep pushing forward. It's a balance of when do we want to add a feature that is a Me Too kind of feature to make sure that we can keep up with what the productivity suites that they have today have versus when can we add a feature that's going to be new and exciting. So one of the things that we hear a lot of times is the fact that we don't have pivot tables the way you have pivot tables in spreadsheets. Well, there are a lot of gadgets out there that are like pivot tables and even more useful than just the regular pivot table. There's one from Panorama that I use quite a bit that's actually really cool. And the nice part about it is it's a gadget. And since it's a gadget, I can take that and I can embed it into a site.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the big question is how are people using SharePoint? I've seen everything from next question, privacy is one of the hurdles. And yeah, data privacy and security and all those kinds of things, they're absolutely going to be questions that you run into. A few things I would say around this. First off, a lot of it is just a philosophical battle. People are accustomed to having stuff on site, and there's a correlation in people's minds between being able to see the server and the amount of security and privacy that exists. If you ask a lot of people around the world, they're going to think that flying is more dangerous than driving a car, but anyone who ever pays attention to statistics knows that's not the case. But you're not in control when you're flying. So it's the same kind of thing here, where over time people will get more accustomed to it. One of the analogies I use is think about how ATMs work, where 10 years ago you could go to a bank and there'd be nobody at the ATM, but there'd be a line at the teller, and now you go to a bank and there's a line at the ATM and there's nobody at the teller. And so people just get more and more accustomed to using new technologies to replace old technologies, but it does take a period of time. the more and more you focus, and that was part of the goal of this presentation, was to focus on all the benefits of it, not necessarily the features and functionalities and say, hey, we can be just as good at a cheaper price, but this just makes sense. This is how things are going to go. Again, Google's brand, our number one asset in terms of helping us differentiate from our competitors are our data centers, but our number one asset in the face of the market is our brand. Everybody knows Google. I can get any meeting I want to just by saying, hey, I'm coming from Google and I'd love to spend an hour with you. They're more than happy to do that. We would kill ourselves if we decided that we're just going to start, snooping into people's emails and having all sorts of security leaks and so forth. I'm sure people have heard about the leak with Twitter, and Twitter actually released a statement saying that wasn't a Google Apps error, that was actually a user error. And there are some things that you need to do as a Google Apps customer to train your users just on good behavior in terms of how do you have your password set up and so forth. But as you get larger and larger companies, that's where they're doing things like single sign-on integrations or syncing with directory services. So I see another note here asking, how does Google Apps for email integrate with directory services like AD? We do have a directory sync tool that you can create so you can still manage as the customer the AD environment, and then we'll automatically sync up with that. When can we expect to be able to let our users log into Google using Google Apps hosted account instead of needing a Gmail account too to be able to get into voice, analytics, checkout, etc.? There's always going to be a bit of a difference between what people can get to with their Gmail account and what they can get to with their Google Apps account. And we do try and make that experience more seamless in the future. I think that's a goal. But it's been the way that we've worked to date, and I would anticipate the way that we continue to work is that we're going to release things to the consumer world first, let people try it out before they're paying for it, and before we're standing behind and saying, yes, you can run your company on this. And then as we get more and more feedback, then we'll start to bring it into the enterprise product. So it would be perfectly reasonable to assume that there'd be tighter integrations with these things as time goes on, but I don't think it's something we're going to jump into right away. How do you typically go about clearing the big brother objection? Google is mining my data, emails, docs, etc. for ads, and who knows what else. How can I ensure the privacy of my confidential data? Again, we're contractually obligated not to do those things. It's a trust thing. And when I'm going out to meet with people or when I'm talking to people on my team, the number one thing is to say, A, we're confident that we're doing the right thing. B, we're contractually obligated. C, look at all these other companies that are starting to come on. That story becomes much easier to swallow as you get the City of Washington, D.C., Motorola, Genentech, Avago, Johnson Diversey. These are big organizations. These aren't little companies who couldn't justify spending the reasonable amount of money on email infrastructure. These are large organizations who have gone through their due diligence, and they've determined that's safe enough for them. So if it's safe enough for those types of organizations, do you really have concerns above and beyond that? Some companies do, and that's okay. I'm not suggesting that every single company is going to switch to Gmail by the end of the year, but I think that the number of companies that are starting to think about it is increasing every single day. And seeing a lot of these questions, clients keep telling me anyone in Google can read their emails. No, we can't. And how do we tackle this? I don't know, but just ask them their source and point to the contract and say, it's a bunch of nonsense. Can I expect integration with Google Voice? Absolutely. No clue when. Can you touch upon the archiving features in more depth? Can you prevent users from permanently deleting? Yes, absolutely. So what happens with Google Message Discovery is the email flows through an entirely separate set of data centers where we keep a separate copy of the emails. And that way, no matter what the user does, you always have a copy of that email. And then you give specific rights to specific people to be able to search across all those emails. So maybe only people in your legal department and things along those lines. So I'm seeing a couple of questions here about user change management and how do you get people comfortable with the product. One of the big things I think is, to think about when you're implementing Google Apps is that user change management is important. And it's important to understand that you probably already have a couple allies internally. So one of the more common practices that we see is a company will send a survey out to their customer base to say, hey, who already uses Gmail? Who likes using these products? And find some people who like it. One of the things that I'm starting to recognize more and more over the past couple of years is that one of the big differences, you don't train new employees on how to use the email system because you're putting them in amongst other employees who already know how to use the email system. So even if the new person doesn't know how to use it, everybody around them does, and there's really not a big learning curve issue. Same thing here at Google. Anytime a new person comes on, their first day, they're always kind of taken aback by using Gmail and Google Apps for all their applications. but everybody around them is using Google already. So a good way to combat this when you're working with a company is to find some people internally that already like it, get them super trained. That's one. Two is make sure that you train the people who are go-to resources. So the help desk, obviously, executive admins, obviously, make sure that they're trained. Spend some additional time. And we have some really good materials, but this is absolutely a place where partners can fit in and provide some services and help around these areas. Have lunch and learn types of workshops and help people get comfortable with it. And over time, they will get there. As I said, most people, once they start using it, they do like it. But there is a little bit of change. I was on an email thread with a Senior VP of Engineering over here at Google and one of his friends externally who was considering using Gmail, but he was really concerned about how can I use Gmail as my business client? I've been on Outlook for years, and really is it going to be able to meet my needs? And the response back was it took the Senior VP over here 2 to 3 weeks to get comfortable with it, but once he did, he was saving an hour to 2 a day because he didn't have to worry about archiving and organizing the folders and everything like that. The productivity went way up after that first couple weeks. But it's like anything else in life. If it's easy, you're probably not getting a whole lot of benefit out of it. You know, they call them growing pains for a reason. It hurts a little bit, but then you're bigger and you're better for it. So it will be a better process, but it's not something you can just throw on them and expect them to get there right away. Can you share a document with someone outside of Google Apps without a Google Apps account or a Google account? So there's two parts to this question, really. One is you can make it a domain-wide decision as to whether or not you give your users the ability to share outside their domain. And then two is they will need to get a Google account, but they can use any email address, a Yahoo email address, an MSN email address to be able to get a way to log into the Google Apps, Google Docs. So some stuff on Google Sites. What else is coming there? Templating in sites, copying sites. Yes, there's a lot of things that we're working on down those areas. And again, you're not going to have to worry about, oh boy, I'm going to have to go do an upgrade. To get that additional functionality, it's going to be there. I don't have a specific roadmap, and I don't know if this is on the plan for a future master seller, but it might be worthwhile to do some sort of a high-level roadmap of kind of some of the areas that we're working on. So I'm just kind of giving that suggestion to Michelle as we're talking here. What are your plans for integrating apps with enterprise directories? Already exists. You can do that with our directory sync services. So that's a pretty common question I'm seeing here and something we already have. So it's another question that I would point people to the forums as well. I know Jeff is constantly just reading the forums. He doesn't have much else to do. So he just is going through there answering all the questions, and he'll be able to answer them. Make sure you have any questions. Make sure you get answers to all of your questions. But if it's not there today, check again tomorrow because it might be there. We keep adding features and functionalities at a very fast rate. Will we be able to have Google Apps local, like on a LAN device like the search appliance, so customers can opt to store documents locally, not in the cloud? No. Absolutely not. That's not the direction we're going. The cloud is what gives us the benefits. It's what gives us the benefits of our innovation, where we can spread it out to everybody automatically. It's what gives us the scale to be able to give people 25 gigabytes and all these additional features and functionalities for free. Yes, it is a little bit scary sometimes to think, oh no, I'm not going to have the server on site. I'm going to have it somewhere else instead. But I promise you, our data centers are more secure. Our redundancy and reliability is better than anything any other company can build. Maybe a few exceptions, but I would suggest it's pretty high up there. We have a lot of different customers, much bigger than the companies you're talking to. I'd be willing to bet in 99% of the instances that are already using Google Apps, and they're happy and they're confident that it is the right way to go. So again, if somebody's completely hung up on this, maybe they're not the right company to sell it to. But more and more, as more companies sign on and companies are hearing of other companies using either Google or another cloud offering, they're going to get there. And another final note on that is ask them what other types of cloud offerings they might be using. I find that some of the more common ones are online banking or being able to do benefits and 401k and so forth. And I've made this statement a bunch of times. So you're telling me that you're not comfortable putting your email in the cloud, but you're perfectly okay putting your CEO's social security number into a hosted offering. That inherently just doesn't make sense to me. And it is a thought process that people have to go through, but I promise you it's there. It's going to take some time. As more and more customers are using Google Apps, it'll be clear that it's really not as scary as it seems, but I'm getting the high sign from Michelle that my time is just about up, so thank you very much for paying attention.
Thank you very much, Tom. We really appreciate you being here. I know there's a lot of questions that we haven't gotten to. We had great attendance today, and there's definitely a lot left to answer. So we're going to answer those offline. We have a transcript of all the Q&A and the chats that we did today, so we will either follow up with you directly, or we'll be posting answers to the questions in the forum and on the solution provider site, which is, again, apps.getportal.com. And this presentation is already available in the Learn to Sell solution provider site. It's called the Google Apps Overview Presentation. You can download it and make a copy. and edit it for your own purposes, and you can customize it depending on the customer you're presenting to. So again, that's already available. And we are recording this webinar, and the recorded webinar and Tom's specific presentation will both be posted in the webinar archive section of the solution provider site, which you can get to from the Learn to Sell section. So I know that's a lot of links I just gave, but I'll also be following up with everyone via email, just with links to these various sections of the solution provider site, and with updates on where you can find answers to all your questions. So with that, we're already about a minute over, so thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great day.